March 23, 1952. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was arrested at his home on Edge Avenue at 6:15 a.m. by a team of federal agents and New York City police detectives. The charges were conspiracy to distribute heroin, a federal offense that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison. Johnson, who had been arrested more than 40 times over the previous 30 years, understood the choreography of arrest, the ritualized violence of handcuffs and rough handling and pointed guns that always accompanied the moment when the law asserted its power over those who lived outside it. But something about this particular arrest felt different to him. The agents seemed too confident. The detectives seemed too pleased with themselves. And one detective in particular, a thick-built Irish-American named Joseph Reardon, who had been with the NYPD for 23 years, watched Johnson being handcuffed with an expression that combined triumph and barely concealed hatred. Johnson knew Reardon by reputation. Everyone in Harlem's criminal community knew Reardon. He was a detective assigned to the narcotics division, notorious for his aggressive tactics and his open contempt for Negro criminals. Over the past 5 years, Reardon had arrested dozens of black drug dealers, numbers, runners, and street criminals, often using evidence that seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed, too clean to be entirely legitimate. But arrests were arrests. Convictions were convictions, and the criminal justice system did not typically question the methods of white detectives who claimed to be fighting crime in Negro neighborhoods. Reardon had built a career on putting black men in prison, and now, standing in Bumpy Johnson's expensive apartment, watching the most powerful Negro crime boss in New York City being led away in handcuffs, he was clearly savoring what he believed would be the capstone achievement of his law enforcement career. As Johnson was being processed at the federal building in Lower Manhattan, his wife, Mayim, immediately contacted their attorney, a skilled criminal defense lawyer named William Constler, who had represented Johnson in previous cases. Kunstler arrived at the federal building by noon and was permitted a brief consultation with his client. Johnson, sitting in a holding cell, described the arrest and the charges in detail. Federal conspiracy to distribute heroin, alleged involvement with a network of dealers operating throughout Harlem, evidence including recorded phone conversations, testimony from informants, and physical evidence seized from locations Johnson was alleged to control. The case seemed comprehensive, carefully constructed, and potentially devastating. A conviction could result in 15 to 20 years in federal prison. At age 46, such a sentence might effectively be a life sentence. But as Constler reviewed the initial discovery documents provided by federal prosecutors, something struck him as unusual. The investigation had been conducted primarily by Detective Joseph Reardon of the NYPD, working in coordination with federal narcotics agents. Nearly all of the evidence had been collected by Reardon or by informants working under Reardon's supervision. The recorded phone conversations had been made using equipment Reardon had personally installed. The physical evidence had been seized during raids that Reardon had personally led. In essence, the entire case rested on the work of a single detective who had an obvious professional interest in bringing down Bumpy Johnson and an equally obvious personal animosity toward Negro criminals. This concentration of evidentiary control in the hands of one detective, while not necessarily proof of misconduct, raised questions about the integrity of the investigation. Constler shared these concerns with Johnson during their consultation. Johnson listened carefully, his face impassive, processing the information with the analytical mind that had allowed him to survive, prosper in the criminal underworld for 3 decades. Then he said something that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "I think Reardon planted evidence. I think some of this case is fabricated, and I think if we dig deep enough, we'll find proof that he's dirty." Constler asked what made Johnson so certain. Johnson's answer was based on 20 years of studying the patterns of law enforcement, understanding how investigations worked, recognizing when things fit together too perfectly. The phone conversations they recorded, Johnson explained, include details about shipments and transactions that I never discussed on any phone, because I never discuss business on phones that can be tapped. The informants they're using, I've never met 3 of them, which means either they're lying about working for me or Reardon coached them on what to say. And the physical evidence they seized from the warehouse on 142nd Street. That location wasn't even connected to me until Reardon's investigation. Someone told him it was mine. Someone gave him information that led directly to evidence that was conveniently placed where he could find it. Over the next 6 weeks, as Johnson remained in federal custody awaiting trial, Kunstler and a team of private investigators began conducting their own investigation. Not of the heroin conspiracy charges, but of Detective Joseph Reardon himself. They interviewed police officers who had worked with Reardon over the years. They spoke with defense attorneys who had represented defendants in cases Reardon had investigated. They examined court transcripts from previous trials where Reardon had testified. And slowly, carefully, they assembled a picture of a detective whose career was built on a foundation that included legitimate police work but also included patterns of behavior that suggested corruption, evidence tampering, and racial animus that went beyond the structural racism common in law enforcement at the time. Several former NYPD officers, speaking confidentially to Kunstler's investigators, described Reardon as obsessively focused on high-profile arrests that would advance his career. One retired detective stated that Reardon had once told him that he did uncare whether defendants were actually guilty as long as they were convicted, because convictions were what got detectives promoted and transferred to better assignments. Another former colleague described witnessing Reardon plant drugs on a suspect during a raid, though this officer had not reported the incident at the time for fear of retaliation. A third officer, still active with the NYPD, stated that Reardon frequently bragged about his skill at manipulating informants into providing testimony that would support whatever narrative Reardon wanted to establish, regardless of what the informants had actually witnessed. The defense team also discovered financial irregularities in Reardon's personal life that suggested he was receiving income beyond his NYPD salary. Bank records, obtained through legal means, that Kunstler would later describe as creative but not illegal, showed deposits into Reardon's account that could not be explained by his police salary or any known legitimate source. These deposits, ranging from $500 to $2,000, appeared approximately every 3 months over a 5-year period. The total amount involved was more than $30,000. A substantial sum in 1952, and one that raised obvious questions about where the money was coming from. The timing of several deposits corresponded with the conclusion of major cases Reardon had investigated, suggesting a possible pattern of payment for results. Most damningly, the investigation uncovered connections between Reardon and several white organized crime figures who competed with Johnson for control of Harlem's heroin trade. These connections were not conclusive proof of corruption, but they were suggestive and troubling. Johnson's trial began on May 12, 1952, in federal court in Manhattan. The prosecution presented what appeared to be an overwhelming case. Recorded phone conversations in which voices identified as Johnson's discussed heroin shipments, testimony from 4 informants who claimed to have worked as dealers in Johnson's organization, physical evidence, including packages of heroin seized from locations allegedly controlled by Johnson, financial records showing unexplained deposits into Johnson's bank accounts that suggested income from drug sales, and throughout it all, Detective Joseph Reardon testified as the prosecution's star witness, walking the jury through the evidence, explaining how his 18-month investigation had uncovered Johnson's conspiracy, presenting himself as a dedicated law enforcement professional who had risked his life to bring a dangerous criminal to justice. But Kunstler, when his turn came to cross-examine Reardon, did not focus on the evidence against Johnson. Instead, he focused on Reardon himself. The cross-examination lasted 3 full days and systematically dismantled Reardon's credibility. Kunstler began by questioning Reardon about his investigative methods, forcing him to admit that he had conducted much of the investigation alone, without oversight from his supervisors, without the involvement of other detectives who might have served as witnesses to his evidence gathering. Then Kunstler moved to Reardon's history, bringing out court transcripts from previous cases where defense attorneys had questioned the reliability of his testimony, where judges had expressed concerns about his evidence handling procedures, where suspects had claimed that Reardon had planted evidence or coerced statements. On the second day of cross-examination, Kunstler produced the bank records showing the unexplained deposits into Reardon's account. Reardon, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning, stammered that the deposits were from a family inheritance. When Kunstler asked for documentation of this inheritance, Reardon claimed the documents had been lost. when Consular produced records showing that Reardon's parents were still alive and that he had no deceased relatives who might have left him money. Reardon changed his story, claiming the deposits were from private security work he had done on his days off. When Kunstler asked for the names of the companies that had hired him for this security work, Reardon became hostile and evasive, eventually stating that he could not remember the details. On the third day, Kunstler brought out the phone records, showing contacts between Reardon and known associates of Vita. The courtroom, which had been relatively quiet during most of the trial, suddenly became tense as the implications of these records became clear. Consular asked Reardon directly, "Detective Reardon, can you explain why you were in regular phone contact with Anthony a known member of the Genovius crime family, during the same period when you were investigating Mr. Johnson?" Reardon's face flushed red. He claimed that the contacts were part of a separate investigation. When Consular asked for documentation of this separate investigation, Reardon stated that the records were confidential. When Consular pointed out that no such investigation appeared in NYPD files, Reardon accused the defense of having improper access to police records. But the most devastating moment of Consular's cross-examination came when he called to the stand Detective Michael O'Brien, a retired NYPD officer who had worked with Reardon from 1947 to 1950. O'Brien, who had been located by Consular's investigators and who had agreed to testify under subpoena, described witnessing Reardon plant evidence during a raid in 1949. According to O'Brien, during a search of a suspect's apartment, Reardon had pulled a bag of heroin from his own pocket and placed it in a dresser drawer, then claimed to have discovered it during the search. O'Brien stated that he had confronted Reardon about this after the raid, and Reardon had responded that sometimes you have to help the evidence along to make sure the guilty get convicted. Bryan had not reported the incident at the time because he feared retaliation from Reardon and his allies in the department, but he stated that his conscience had troubled him ever since, and that he was now willing to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. The prosecution objected strenuously to O'Brien's testimony, arguing that it was irrelevant to the charges against Johnson and that it constituted an improper attempt to put a police officer on trial instead of the defendant. But the judge, clearly troubled by what he had heard during Consular's cross-examination, allowed the testimony to stand. The jury, which had appeared sympathetic to the prosecution throughout the first week of trial, now looked uncertain and skeptical as they studied Reardon, who sat in the witness box, visibly sweating. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Kunstler concluded his cross-examination by asking Reardon a series of questions about his racial attitudes and his history with Negro defendants. He produced disciplinary records showing that Reardon had been accused of excessive force against black suspects on 4 separate occasions. He brought forward testimony from a former defendant who stated that Reardon had called him racial slurs during an interrogation. He presented a letter that Reardon had written to the NYPD commissioner in 1948, arguing that Negro neighborhoods required more aggressive policing methods because, in Reardon's words, those people don't respond to anything but force. By the time Kunstler finished, Detective Joseph Reardon was no longer the dedicated lawman bringing a dangerous criminal to justice. He was a corrupt, racist officer whose entire investigation was now suspect. The jury deliberated for 4 days, an unusually long time that suggested deep disagreement among the 12 members. When they finally returned with a verdict on May 28, 1952, they found Johnson guilty on 2 of the 5 conspiracy counts, but acquitted him on the other 3. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of 15 years in federal prison, but the mixed verdict suggested that the jury had been troubled by questions about Reardon's credibility, even as they found sufficient evidence to support at least some of the charges. Johnson, standing to receive the verdict, showed no emotion. He had expected conviction. The criminal justice system in 1952 was not designed to protect Negro defendants from corrupt white detectives. The verdict was predetermined by structural racism and institutional corruption. But what Johnson had accomplished through Kunstler's devastating cross-examination was something more valuable than acquittal. He had destroyed Joseph Reardon. The fallout from Reardon's testimony began immediately. The NYPD Internal Affairs Division announced that it was opening an investigation into Reardon's conduct based on the testimony presented during Johnson's trial. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office stated that it would review all previous cases in which Reardon had played a significant investigative role, particularly cases where defendants had alleged evidence tampering or coercion. Several defense attorneys who had represented previous Reardon targets filed motions for new trials based on newly discovered evidence of Reardon's corruption. The New York Times, which had initially covered Johnson's trial as a straightforward drug case, now ran a front-page story with the headline "Decorated Detective Accused of Planting Evidence and Mob Connections." Within 6 weeks of Johnson's conviction, Detective Joseph Reardon was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. The investigation, which lasted until October 1952, uncovered substantial evidence supporting the allegations made during Johnson's trial. Bank deposits that Reardon could not explain, phone contacts with known organized crime figures, testimony from multiple former colleagues describing incidents where Reardon had manipulated evidence or coerced statements from suspects. While the investigation did not result in criminal charges against Reardon, largely because the evidence of specific criminal acts was circumstantial, and because prosecuting a police officer would have been politically difficult, it did result in his forced retirement from the NYPD in December 1952. Reardon's retirement was officially described as voluntary, but everyone involved understood that he had been given a choice between retiring with his pension or facing public charges that would almost certainly end his career and possibly result in criminal prosecution. He chose retirement, but the damage to his reputation was permanent and severe. The dozens of cases he had investigated were now tainted by questions about evidence integrity. Several defendants who had been convicted based primarily on Reardon's testimony were granted new trials or had their convictions overturned. The NYPD, embarrassed by the revelations about one of its supposedly exemplary detectives, implemented new oversight procedures for narcotics investigations to prevent similar abuses in the future. For Bumpy Johnson, the exposure of Reardon provided no immediate practical benefit. He was still convicted, still sentenced to 15 years, still transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in California to serve his time, but within Harlem's community and within the broader criminal underworld. Johnson's destruction of Reardon became a legend that enhanced his already formidable reputation. He had been arrested by a corrupt detective, framed with planted evidence, convicted by a racist system. But he had not gone quietly. He had fought back using the only weapons available to him: information and intelligence, and the careful exposure of his enemies' vulnerabilities. And while he could not prevent his own conviction, he had ensured that the detective who framed him paid a price, lost his career, saw his legacy destroyed. The story of Johnson's trial and Reardon's exposure spread rapidly through Harlem and beyond. It became a parable about fighting power even when you cannot win, about resistance even when the outcome is predetermined, about the importance of taking your enemy down with you if you cannot avoid going down yourself. For Negro Harlemites, who lived under constant surveillance from racist police, who saw their neighbors and family members arrested on questionable charges by detectives who viewed all black people as criminals, Johnson's destruction of Reardon was deeply satisfying. It proved that even corrupt white detectives, with the full power of the law behind them, were not invincible, that their credibility could be challenged, that their corruption could be exposed, that their careers could be ended if you were smart enough and determined enough to gather the evidence needed to destroy them. From his cell in Alcatraz, Johnson would later write to his wife Mame about the trial and its aftermath. The letter, preserved in the Johnson family papers, reflected his understanding that the trial had been both a legal defeat and a moral victory. "They sent me here for 15 years, he wrote. "They took my freedom, my business, my life outside these walls. But I took Reardon's career. I took his reputation. I made sure everyone knows he's dirty, that he frames innocent people, that he works for the mob while pretending to fight crime. That won't get me out of here. But it means something. It means I didn't just accept what they did to me. It means I fought back with the weapons I had. And it means that the next detective who thinks about framing a Negro defendant might remember what happened to Joseph Reardon and think twice." The broader implications of Johnson's trial extended beyond his personal case or Reardon's ruined career. The exposure of corruption in the NYPD's Narcotics Division contributed to growing awareness of systemic problems in law enforcement, particularly in how police interacted with minority communities. Several civil rights organizations, including the NAA, cited the Reardon case in their advocacy for police oversight and accountability. The case became part of a larger narrative about racial justice and the need for reforms to prevent corrupt officers from targeting black defendants with impunity. While these reforms would take decades to implement and would never fully solve the problems of police corruption and racial bias, the Johnson trial represented a moment when the veil was pulled back, when the mythology of honest police fighting noble battles against criminals was exposed as often being far more complicated and far more corrupt than the public wanted to believe. Johnson would serve 11 years of his 15-year sentence before being released on parole in March 1963. When he returned to Harlem, he found a neighborhood transformed by the heroin epidemic that had exploded during his absence. A community struggling with addiction and violence that made the relatively organized criminal economy of the 1940s seem almost benign by comparison. But he also found that his reputation had, if anything, grown during his imprisonment. The story of how he had destroyed Detective Reardon had become part of Harlem's oral history, told and retold in bars and barbershops. A story about resistance and intelligence, and refusing to be a passive victim even when the system was rigged against you. Young criminals who had not even been born when Johnson was convicted knew the story. It inspired them. It taught them that power was not just about violence or money, but about information and strategy, and the willingness to expose your enemies, even at great personal cost. Joseph Reardon lived another 21 years after his forced retirement, dying in 1973 at age 72. He spent those years in bitter obscurity, working as a private security guard, drinking heavily, and telling anyone who would listen that he had been railroaded by a slick defense attorney and a guilty gangster who had corrupted the system to escape justice. But no one believed him. His reputation was destroyed. His cases were tainted. His legacy was not as a decorated detective who put criminals in prison, but as a corrupt cop who framed innocent people and worked for the mob. Bumpy Johnson, who outlived Reardon by 45 years, if we measure life not by heartbeat, but by reputation, had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. He had made sure that the detective who tried to frame him paid a price that lasted forever. In that sense, though, Johnson went to Alcatraz and served 11 hard years behind bars. He won the only victory that was available to him. The victory of ensuring that his enemy's destruction was permanent, while his own legend only grew stronger with time.